A Mirage video in the Big 25. Yes, I know this might be surprising to some people, and it is also surprising to me because Mirage is not a frame that I really play at all. But in my Discord, there has been some discussion around her and a couple of different builds, and the one that I'm going to showcase for you guys today is, well, let me just show it to you. Yeah, this is a pretty fun one and has actually made me enjoy Mirage because besides builds like this, I am not a Mirage enjoyer. But now I do have to say that, yeah, this specific setup is actually quite strong and pretty fun. The main focus of our build today is only around these two abilities, Null and Eclipse, because while Hall of Mirrors and Prism are pretty good, they don't actually do anything to contribute to the loop that this build has, so I won't really be covering them. Null though, this ability genuinely might be in contest for one of, if not the best ability in the game, just because of how much stuff it does. Casting Null will summon 12 antimatter particles around you at base, and as they orbit around you, they will be giving you 5% DR per, and while the damage reduction is capped to 75% on the helmet version, what has no cap is what happens when you bring in some enemies and then actually let the Null Stars do their thing, which is fly off one by one every second to deal damage to enemies within range. This damage is coded as blast, and as you can see, it also force triggers the status on enemies that it hits, which is why you were seeing the blast symbol next to the ability damage, and as you saw in the clip before, the damage scaling on these stars can get absolutely ridiculous with the right setup. The Null Stars are coded as weapons on the back end, which means that universal damage bonuses like Vigorous Swap, Arcane Arachne, Eclipse do benefit the ability. And the same actually goes for critical scaling. The Null Stars do have the ability to crit, but can only gain crit stats from flat sources like Tenacious Bond, Arcane Crepuscular, and Arcane Avenger. So I am assuming you can already see where this build is starting to go. We're going to try to make these Null Stars as overpowered as they could possibly be. The only other part of this that actually pertains to Mirage is the Eclipse ability, which, as you can see here, allows you to hold down to temporarily increase Mirage's weapon damage, and like I said, that will apply to the Null Stars. One important note is that Eclipse is a multiplicative damage boost, so right now without any mods on Mirage, we are already getting a 240% increase in our damage on the Null Stars, and just to showcase that this does actually work, 43 when they initially hit an enemy, and then if I hold down, 147. So that is already over 3 times more damage than we were getting before. We're just going to jump right in with the modding because that is honestly what makes this build. The loop in game, as you'll see later, is very simple. You cast Eclipse and then you just spam Null Star, but obviously the damage wasn't there yet, and that is where this specific setup comes in. To start, Archon Vitality and Neutron Star. Neutron Star is an augment for Null Star that states that particles deal 240 heat damage with a guaranteed status effect in 8 meters, and then on recast, remaining particles will seek out enemies with a doubled search radius. This augment mod is incredibly important because it is what allows you to spam the Null Star ability and get way more damage than you were going to get before, because heat is one of the best statuses in the game, especially when you combine it with blast, which is AoE. So with our particles now having a separate damage instance of 240 that does trigger the heat status, we can use Archon Vitality to double that heat status, which will double the dot's damage, and overall increase the damage of our Null Stars by way more than if we didn't use these two mods, as remember, heat also armor strips enemies, which will make blast far more effective. For our main Warframe stats, we are just going with positive duration from Prime Continuity, Transient Fortitude, and Armor Intensify for our strength alongside a couple of strength Archon Shards. And then 175 range is a very comfy value to sit at without needing to use overextended, which would absolutely kill our strength, and we want as much of it as possible because a higher strength value is a higher Eclipse multiplication for our Null Stars. Equilibrium will take care of any energy problems, but what is probably confusing you is the Arcane and Aura choice. Combat Discipline is not seen very often, but the reason we use it here is to allow our Null Stars to actually have some critical scaling. Arcane Avenger gives you 45% flat critical chance, and this is the only way besides Harrow's Covenant to actually make the Null Stars crit. But because this is actually an invisibility build, yes, we are going to be invisible the entire time we are doing this, and that is why I have no survivability mods, we aren't going to be getting shot enough to trigger Arcane Avenger, so we have to trigger it ourselves with Combat Discipline. Technically, the amount of health that we lose on a kill to trigger Avenger doesn't matter, so if you want to forma every single slot on your Mirage so that you can use a down-ranked Combat Discipline, you definitely could do that, but I didn't feel like it was necessary. Regardless, Arcane Crepuscular gives us 30% more ability strength and a 3x final crit damage, which is going to serve as our crit damage multiplier for the Null stars, because just like their crit chance, the only way to benefit their crit damage is with a flat source, and that is what Crepuscular is. Crepuscular does require invisibility to trigger though, and that is where the Shade Prime is going to come in with this very specific build. Shade Prime is the precept of Ghost, and if you didn't know, Ghost or the stock mod on the Hurus Kubro make you entirely invisible, but only get disrupted if you use your guns. If you use abilities like Null Star to damage enemies, you just will stay invisible, as the game doesn't consider that attacking. So if we get close to these enemies, you will see that yep, there we go. We are now invisible, and if I hit my Null Star, we stay completely invisible. Let's activate our Eclipse for the damage multiplier, and yeah. You can already see that our damage is getting way up there. You die, please. Thank you. But there is another piece of this puzzle that actually comes in the Tazicor, which is our companion's weapon. The Tazicor is one of the best primers in the game, probably better than the Hellstrom in my opinion, and I got it particularly for this video because we're going to use the Tazicor as a Heat Inherit primer. Now, if you are familiar with Heat Inherit, you'd probably say just use an Epitaph, it is easier, but the problem with using an Epitaph is that it will disrupt our invisibility, which is our survivability, and then you will die. So we have to use a companion weapon, but that actually isn't really that big of a deal, especially if we are going to be using Duplex Bond on our companion. I've explained Heat Inherit a ton of times on the channel, but for anyone who is unfamiliar, Heat is an infinitely stacking DOT. If I continue to shoot this enemy, you will see that the Heat stacks go up and up and up, while the other statuses have caps of 10 or 4 or whatever. Heat can go on as long as you continue to apply it, but this comes with some interesting properties. The very first heat proc that you apply to an enemy is going to determine a couple of the stats for every other heat proc that is applied, no matter what the source is. Those things include the modded heat percentage, a Bane mod, and the status duration. So what this means is that if I apply heat to an enemy with an Epitaph, say, with the Primed Expel Orokin mod, these two heat mods totaling up to 210% more heat damage, even if I then apply a heat proc from Null Star, it is going to act as if it has those buffs, which makes the heat damage that the ability does way stronger. You can't do a Bane mod on a Warframe ability, but now you can. You see why this is so broken? So if we come back to our Shade Prime and on the Tazicor, here's the build we are going to use. I am actually out of Forma, but I wanted to get this video out quickly, so I do not have the time to Forma this 2 more times to put on the Hellfire Heat mod, but that is what should be here. This is a build entirely focused around making your companion prime all these enemies for heat, and then you will be able to Null Star them and nuke them all. The thing about Duplex Bond is that if you just, get all of your duplicated companions out here, yeah, there they are. Look at like, oh, well, this one poor enemy is about to get fried, but I will, I'll summon back in a battle group just so that they can, actually do something. Yeah, you see how ridiculous this priming is? That's because the Tazicor chains between enemies like a beam weapon, so when you actually now use all of our stuff, yeah,